who registered on purpose in the conference form, but they can also actually follow us on YouTube via the links that I also sent, well, recently to you, but they were actually already uploaded in the program yesterday. So people could follow those links and they could, you know, so they're apparently also doing that in parallel, but I'm not able, I mean, I do have actually two screens in front of me, two computers to control it a little bit better, but I'm not able to also see whether people are successfully joining to watch us on YouTube. So that's beyond my control. And also technically, I'm not very much advanced, as some of you know very well, others know less. So my apologies in advance for all sorts of, you know, shortcomings associated with my incapacity to be in control of technical stuff. Without further technical ado, I would like just to explain to the audience, mostly because obviously the speakers, those who were invited to participate in the roundtable, know very well what's it all about, but mostly to explain to the audience what's going on here. I will not repeat, obviously, the title of the roundtable, which is focusing as a shorthand on migration governance, on governance of migration and integration, but I would like to explain sort of the rationale, and that's also kind of my let's say probably the most important part of my intervention here is how it all came about and what I kind of wanted to have with this roundtable. And then there are kind of formal and informal parts to it. I should confess that I started thinking about this organization of this particular session when I knew, of course, that there would be the second Inequality and Diversity Conference organized. I was sort of inspired by the series of webinars that were developed, organized, and put forward by two great teams. One team in Florence at the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute, headed by Andrew Geddes, who is present here among the speakers. And then the second team is Anna Triantafylidou's team at the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration in Toronto, across the Atlantic. So those two webinar series that were, for me, so I'm just giving my personal impression, they were among the first to sort of, you know, take on this technology slash pandemic matrix and use it for profit of uniting more scholars to talk about migration. And I was kind of inspired by this. And so the initial idea was quite simple. I sort of wanted to bring together on board for the roundtable, and this is a formal explanation, people who in their work, most, let's say, of you, used or focused or even contributed to development of the concept of multi-level governance, and in particular in relation to migration governance within the European Union or not, beyond the scope of that kind of research. And because one of those kind of cross-cutting lines in this particular conference is focusing indeed on aspects of multi-level governance, I said, well, that's a great occasion to do it. And that was a kind of initial, you know, way of thinking of what this roundtable could be about. But then eventually it took a broader shape, as speakers already could judge probably from a kind of a long list of questions that I tried to unite in sort of clusters, which is not of greatest importance. And I'll now, let me just do it. I'll now, for the audience, I'll just copy these questions in the chat so that everyone will be able to see the questions right as we actually discuss them. And this is just, you know, a moment. Yes. So, well, these are not all the questions, and it apparently did not copy well. I'll just continue with that later on. But just to give a sense of what kind of broad ideas are actually included, because from this initial way of thinking to have it very narrow and focused on multi-level governance of migration, I said, why just not to discuss all those issues that sort of come, well, to my mind and to minds of many of you, if judging from those events that I attended. And kind of bring this to the audience. Well, here in Russia, but also to the broader audience that is hopefully watching and listening to us now at the conference. So those are not questions that are kind of, it's not a mandatory list. We don't have to follow it. And obviously we are not going to address all of those questions that mentioned here. But they are kind of guiding lines for me at least. And I asked our participants, and that's now I'm explaining the format. I asked our participants to basically pick from this long list one, a couple, or several questions that they would like to focus on. So that's absolutely their choice, a kind of creative approach to this list from me, and address those questions. And this is a particular part of the format. Address those questions in very short opening statements, sort of initial reflections that kind of will set up further discussion among the speakers and also with the audience. I asked all our roundtable participants to give no more than 5-minute kind of reflections initially. And after all of the speakers are done with their reflections, that what can follow afterwards is that they can obviously ask questions to each other. They can also provide some feedback on each other's viewpoints, but essentially they hope they will be open for questions from the audience, or from those people who actually joined us either here in Zoom or via YouTube link. And for these people who would like to ask questions, for the sake of time and also for technical reasons, what we suggest is that you would please use the chat box in the Zoom or the chat box in YouTube channel. And when you actually send your questions here in Zoom, please do not send them to the general chat, not to distract speakers from their elaborations, but please send them to the organizer, Yuri Kabanov. So please find Yuri Kabanov. You see him here on the screen. Find him in the chat box and send your questions to Yuri, and then Yuri will share those questions with us at a later stage when it comes to the questions and answers point. Now, finally, that's probably you'll see I'm a little bit nervous, so it's a final point, but it's probably something that I would like normally to start with, and this is more of an informal part. Is that you could imagine easily that it's a round table, and of course, for a round table, there should normally be a sort of an optimal number of participants, which was a hugely difficult task for me, because I would, of course, like to have even more people from various kind of angles to discuss those issues that are pertinent for us today. But then I had to make a choice, and my choice was very self-centered in the sense that I wanted to invite here those people whom I see, my teachers, my mentors, my colleagues, and my friends. And many of you I know for many, many years, and then some of you I know less. But I'm very, honored to know you all, and I'm very thankful to you all for giving me what you've given in terms of, bringing me in the field of migration studies. And I'm very happy, which is also quite particular, to actually for the first time welcome you as a host in Russia, which usually is not the case. Although it's virtually, although you are not on Russians ground and not in St. Petersburg, neither am I, to be very frank. But I'm very happy that this, kind of reverse kind of event is actually taking place. So I think that's it for now. I think that's enough for this kind of long introduction and for contextualizing. I basically, just to repeat again, for the questions, use the chat box. That's very important, so that we don't lose questions. And also, I will not be now saying anything on individual speakers, but I do have your bios. What I'm going to do, I'm going to share bios of each speaker while they speak, so that you guys, the audience, you would know exactly who is in front of you and what's the sphere of expertise and what kind of questions you could also then address to them. I think that's it. I suggest we proceed in the order that is indicated in the program, which is absolutely not important. So alphabetical kind of order, because you don't have to follow any line. And I suggest that Diego Acosta Carasa start, and then we follow. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Oleg, and thanks to the organizers, and hi to everyone, to the colleagues, and also
Diego,
to those
apparently your sound is not
good
on. I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now, Oleg?
I can hear you.
Fine.
Okay, yeah. So I was just saying that thanks to you, Oleg, and thanks to the organizers, and just to say hi to the rest of the colleagues and to the people who might be following this now or later. And so I would love actually to be in St. Petersburg, which is a city that I like very much, but hopefully soon we will be able to be there in person. In any case, I'm going to concentrate on one of the questions that Oleg sent, and I'm going to do that very briefly, which is the question about what important dimensions of migration governance are still escaping scholars' attention. And I will just make a brief reference also to the Global Compact on migration. I think that we are now facing a narrative on migration which has simplified things in a certain way. Migration is presented as being a problem that is being tackled everywhere by more borders. And when I talk about borders, I talk about not only physical borders, but also legal and digital borders. And I think that narrative, which is very simple, is a narrative that we can see in the political discourse, we can see also in the media discourse, but we can also see that narrative sometimes in the academic discourse. So there are scholars presenting migration law as a field that is moving in the direction of further control and restriction. Other scholars argue that states engage in both opening and closing their borders, but that they only open their borders to those with specialized skills, superb talents, or deep pockets. And I beg to differ with this simple narrative of migration and of migration regulation as being more and more restrictive. And I think that sometimes when we have this kind of overviews, they result from a partial picture that is only focusing on mostly the US, Australia, and the European Union. And by the European Union, I also mean the UK. I think it is very important for the future of academic scholarly, and this is something that is already happening, of course, and many of the colleagues who are, or I would say all the other colleagues in the panel actually are in that direction as well, to take a look at what is happening at regional level in terms of free movement of people. And so far, most of the scholarly thinking about mobility at regional level, free mobility at regional level, used to concentrate only on the EU, and they presented the EU as being an exceptional case, a unique case, a case that will not happen anywhere else in the world. But of course, we have seen, and those of you who are in Russia are very well aware of this, because you have the Eurasian Economic Union where you have free movement of workers. You also have bilateral agreements, for example, between Russia and Belarus, which allows for free movement of citizens from both countries. We are seeing how this is a trend that is happening all around the world. We have more and more examples every year of free movement agreements, either at regional level or at bilateral level. And we can mention examples from South America, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Eurasia, and from other places. So I think this is a very important trend, because obviously when you take into consideration regional free movement agreements, all the debates about mobility and migration are completely changed. So if we are talking about visas, smuggling and trafficking, refugee law, environmental, family migration, irregular migration, labor migration, all the debates on mobility change when you take into consideration free movement agreements. And also the meaning of citizenship itself changes when you take into consideration those agreements, because the status of certain non-nationals comes closer to the status of nationals in that particular country. And I think, as I said, it's very important to understand that it's not only regional agreements, sometimes we have bilateral agreements, but many other times we have unilateral measures that states adopt in order to facilitate the arrival of migrants coming from a particular region. We could mention, for example, the case of Colombia, which has received 2 million Venezuelans in the last 5 years, and how Colombia has tried to facilitate residence status for those Venezuelans, but also their access to healthcare, education, and the right to work. And just briefly, and to conclude, I think that relates very well with the Global Compact on Migration. Actually, if we read the Global Compact on Migration carefully, it is an instrument that repeats two words on several occasions, more than 50 times. The first word that we have in the Global Compact of Migration is facilitate, right? This is an instrument to facilitate mobility. And by facilitating mobility, the idea is that that mobility is going to be safe, regular, and orderly. And the second word that is repeated more than 50 times in the Global Compact is precisely regional, right? So how mobility can be facilitated at regional level. And this is very important because intra-regional migration and actually south-to-south migration is more numerous than south-to-north migration. So I leave it there. Those are just my first reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego, for this precise introduction, looking at one very particular instrument especially, and also at the dynamics that are quite sometimes, let's say, not taken into account. Andrew, I think you are the next. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Hi, Oleg, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be on this roundtable with so many great colleagues all spread all over the world. So thanks very much for the invite. Picking up, I suppose, trying to pick up a little bit from what Diego was talking about and the questions that you sent. I think I might talk at a more general level. And I think Diego made some great points there, which I think in terms of the agendas for our work. I was going to pick up on just two of the issues that you raised, one of which you referred to as kind of major challenges. And then you also talk in your questions about the drivers of global migration governance, which of course are massive questions. There's loads of things we could talk about there, but I'll just say some things that try to connect them. So I'm going to make 3 points basically. One is about what we might call the salience of migration as an issue, because I think that will affect cooperation. The second is about what's called localization, the tension between the global and the local in terms of perhaps state, sub-state, regional dynamics. And the third one is about attitudes and communication around migration. So I'll just I think those maybe connect some of the things that you've been you raised in the questions that you've put into the chat box. So the first point is about salience, and if we're thinking about the kind of prominence of migration at the moment, I think it's kind of slightly paradoxical because I think migration is becoming kind of simultaneously more and less important. Because I think because of the pandemic and the dominance of questions around economic reconstruction, migration is going to be less directly present in political debate, less directly salient, but more present because of the way it connects into issues such as health, economic reconstruction, and things like that. So I think that the presence of migration, if I talk about this, say the European context here, where salience has been very high, salience is fading because other issues are becoming more prominent, but it doesn't mean that migration is becoming less important. It's becoming more embedded in a series of linked issues. I think that changes the dynamics a little bit, the social and political debate around migration, which can create opportunities, but also maybe create some challenges if it's not quite as prominent. The second point I wanted to make is around what I call localization. As if we're looking at challenges around international migration governance and cooperation, I think one of the clearest tendencies in the kind of global politics of migration is the tension between various what you might call levels between sub-state, state, regional, and international cooperation. And in the work I've been doing, I've been particularly interested really in the way in which it's not the dynamic is not so much states and regions adapting to the global, some kind of global template, but actually the way in which the global becomes meaningful in different ways in different states and regional settings. And I think what that means is that variation, fragmentation are likely to be persistent. States will be central, but states are very, very different and are changing, and the way they work has changed. And I think what it also means is you have a tension between what you might call transgovernmentalism and transnationalism. So transgovernmentalism, I think, is very prominent in international migration governance at the more official state-to-state level. And the denotes a transnational network beyond the formal structures of states and their authority are, the levels of development are highly variable. So I think these challenges of localization, variation and fragmentation in the international system, well, they are I think, almost like a necessary characteristic and will remain so. And then the final point is on the drivers of governance, which I think is a really interesting point, because the drivers of migration and the drivers of migration governance are very different things. I don't think it's necessarily migration that drives migration governance. But one issue I did want to pick up on is attitudes to migration.
Я вставила, я как бы там сейчас.
Can you please switch on the microphone?
Andrew.
And Professor Geddes, can you please switch on the microphone?
Maybe the host inadvertently switched him off.
Yeah, I got muted there, but I'll stop anyway because other people were talking in the background. So I'll stop there, Oleg.
Andrew, I'm not quite sure actually what was the kind of last part that you were saying, because I couldn't hear either. So there was.
I don't know. Yeah, I wasn't sure what was going on. I kind of lost everything and then got muted. No, it was just a point about one of the drivers of migration governance. To what extent attitudes to migration are a driver of migration governance? But one of the issues there is that there's, certainly in terms of future research agendas, a need to have a more developed understanding of attitudes to migration as they really are, beyond the usual suspects of destination countries, to understand, also to be able and to think about how communication can develop a resonance of attitudes as they are.
Thank you, Andrew. Now I think the next on the list is Karolina Kluchevska.
Can you hear me? Can you nod, Oleg? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm actually very sorry that we didn't hear what Andrew was saying, because I think it was a very interesting moment that we missed. But my few words on these many questions that Oleg prepared for us are a bit different, perhaps the perspective from which I start, because I start from a very local context, and from there look at the global level instead of going like the other way around. So my context of expertise, if we might call it this way, is Central Asia. In the migration context, this is very much linked to Russia. So what I'm going to pick up now about is the role of countries of origin. And this links to, so this is question number 4, this links to another question: what perspectives seem to be missing in literature on migration governance? And I will tell you why I think this is the case, referring to the post-Soviet space. So obviously the perspectives of migrant origin countries are completely different from migrant receiving countries. And this is part of the research that we did together with Oleg in the previous years. If we look at Tajikistan, for example, right, as one of the most important migrant sending states in the post-Soviet space, because a country of 9 million people, you have between 1 million, 1.5 million labor migrants living in Russia, which is about 20% of labor force of the country. So this is a massive labor immigration. This country also has some sort of an immigration policy, and I think it applies to many migrant origin countries. Immigration policy doesn't mean that the country pushes out migrants, but this is kind of approaches and legal instruments that the country develops to engage with labor migrants who live abroad, formally or informally, this kind of instruments. So generally, I think this perspective on this migrant sending countries is very much missing in the post-Soviet space, because first of all, in research, there is some sort of a continuity of Soviet-era trends on research on migration. So migration is until now very much tackled from a demographic statistics perspective. So scholars look at this macro level socioeconomic dynamics. And this is obviously an angle that is being challenged as well now, but it's still dominant. across the post-Soviet space. The second reason has to do with international organizations. This is because another strand in research on migration is through this migration and development framework, right? And so this is thinking about what migration can bring to the host state and to the country of origin in terms of benefits. And this is the framework that was started and promoted in the post-Soviet region by international organizations, including the IOM as one of its most important promoters. And the second strand of research is the regime-focused analysis. This means that it's very often assumed that because countries of the post-Soviet region are classified as authoritarian because of its regime type, it's assumed that the immigration policy will be authoritarian as well. So this is why there is no attempt to unpack what is actually happening, why this decision making is happening in a certain way. It's just assumed that these countries are bad, so their immigration policies must be bad as well. These countries do not like the immigrants. This is the general trend, how it's looked at. But when you unpack actually how this immigration policy is made, you will see lots of diversity. So first of all, there will be different actors internally who have very different positions, different rationalities and interests. For example, the Ministry of Labor will be interested in welfare and migrants' rights, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will be interested in not talking about migration because this is seen as a reason for shame, admitting that countries have a massive labor immigration. In the second place, there are problems related to budgets of many migrant sending countries in the post-Soviet space. So, for example, yes, in Tajikistan has over 1 million migrants abroad, but it has only 5 Tajik consulates in Russia. So obviously, even if there is interest to engage with labor migrants, the state doesn't have a capacity because of its lacking funding to provide assistance to these numbers. And then there are different external factors that matter very much. And in the post-Soviet region, this is Russia as the main host country for many migrant sending states. Because this is what Diego was mentioning, if you have a visa-free regime, then you cannot control migration even if you want to shape in some ways the migrant flows from migrant sending countries, right? Because you can enter the territory of Russia without a visa, but it doesn't, because you don't need it, but it doesn't give you automatically the right to work in this place. Oleg will, I think, talk a bit more about Russia, so we can leave it here. But what's important here is also that Russia is a dominant state in the post-Soviet region, which means that migrant sending countries have this unequal, asymmetrical power relations with Russia. So even issues that take time and efforts from the perspective of migrant sending countries to negotiate with Russia do not have any importance for Russia. And the last point that I'm going to make is the influence of international organizations in the post-Soviet region, because there was this massive boom arrival in the 90s, which continues until now in most of the countries in the post-Soviet space. International organizations are sharing this expert knowledge, the so-called best practices, and also channeling funding, right? So you have funding on one hand and knowledge on the other hand. And the outcome is that very often they promote, which happens in other regions too, right, marketization and control of migrants through this migration and development framework, how to make use of migrants, but this very often doesn't have to do with human rights. So I will stop here. Just one last sentence referring to one of the other comments, questions that Oleg prepared. What about migrants? How do they really look at it? And I think in the post-Soviet region, because we have certain patterns of relations between citizens and the state, the states do not really ask what do migrants want, but it doesn't mean that they do not engage with migrants, right? So for example, Tajikistan engages actively in discussions about migrants with Russia, but it's still not discussions with migrants, how migrants would like to improve their own situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Karolina. You indeed picked up on a couple of questions that I wanted to address, but I also made a note for myself that there is something that you kind of hinted at but did not develop, and I tell you I will ask this question later on when we get to the discussion. So now I give the floor to Sandra. Sandra.
Yes, hello. Nice to see you all on the screen. So I would like to address the question of the big trends that I see in international migration governance as one of your questions in connection to the multiple crises, but I would not say that these trends are necessarily a result or a consequence of recent crises, but maybe a more general and perhaps even structural trends. So it's even maybe, again, a higher level of abstraction, but so very much focused on the global level. I would like to highlight two trends that I think are taking place. One, the first trend is the growing dissociation and differentiation of immigration policies between wanted and unwanted forms of migration. And the second trend is a transformation and partial erosion of the international refugee regime. So the first trend, perhaps the EU's sectoral approach to economic immigration policy is a salient illustration of what I mean by the growing dissociation and differentiation of immigration policies. In the absence of a political will from the member states to have a common European immigration policy for economic migrants, the European Commission has gone towards a sectoral approach, devising specific directives for very particular groups of workers. So we have today directives on seasonal workers, on researchers, students, and intra-corporate transferees, but we don't have an EU economic immigration policy. So we could say this is typical of the EU. It does what it can and cannot move further ahead. But I would say similar stalemates are now also developing in states, nation states, that with politicization, the scope for designing immigration policies becomes more and more narrow. And as a result of this, we see more selective, more differentiated, and more dissociated channels for legal migration. This means, as Diego was saying, immigration policies now for economic migration do not necessarily become more restrictive all over, right? We have more openings, but I would also not say that at the regional level, we have a general trend towards freedom of movement. I think there are counter movements as well. And within the regional economic integration template that diffuses around the world, where we do have certain mobility regimes, I would say that the business mobility, the highly skilled business mobility, is the one that is the most consensual, stable, and liberalized, and in a manner that is also legally binding. And this is important. It is the only, I think, area where we see legally binding commitments among countries for facilitating migration. Yes, we see that in the regional economic communities, also in ASEAN, which is the most, restrictive of all, but for this kind of people, they do have some rules in practice, and also the North American Free Trade Association is similar in these respects. And we see that also in bilateral preferential trade agreements, which increasingly include mobility rules for business people and also investment treaties. A similar trend that goes into this, or more similar development that enters into this trend of more selective migration policies would be also in the field of citizenship, this issue of citizenship for sale that we observe in Europe and elsewhere. So resuming this first trend, I would say immigration policies become more differentiated, more selective, and in parts more commercialized, marketized, right, for certain types of migrants. More marketized, with binding commitments where the state steps back then towards these migrants. But for the unwanted forms of migration, we see the counter movement. There, the state becomes the main actor, and with a repressive orientation to develop actually what we could call not immigration policies, but rather policies of non-migration or of immobility. And these policies of immobility are the big bulk of liberal democracies' migration policies today. They are targeted at dissuading people from moving, and they move more and more upstream towards the countries of origin of migrants to prevent the people from leaving in the first place. And this is where I see the second trend that I would like to bring into the discussions. I think we need to start talking also in research about the partial dismantling of the international refugee regime, or at least its transformation. I think people are still too hesitant to really find words for what is going on. And I think what we can really say is that the transformation takes place in terms of the spontaneous asylum, which is the one that is most codified in the Geneva Convention, whereby a refugee travels to a country and has the right to have an access to an asylum procedure there. That this institution is now becoming more and more the exception, and the new policies seek to promote protection within the region of origin of the refugees and prevent the refugees from moving towards the state of asylum where they could deposit their claim. And so we see more and more protection in the region, in the immediate neighborhood of refugee-producing countries, and even within countries of origin in so-called safe zones. Right? It's an idea that is taking shape. What it means that we turn away from the idea of the state and the state's responsibility to grant protection to individuals who have lost the protection of their country of origin. And instead we move towards a sort of development policy paradigm where protection consists in money and aid for regions affected by these flows in the immediate neighborhood. The responsibility of the state, also before the law, fades away. This is no longer based on entitlements, on individual rights and legal proceedings, but it's based on some soft instruments such as loans, programs, projects, and the like. So with this transformation of the notion of protection, we also see a delegalization of the international refugee regime. And I think this trend is also very much at the core of the new multilateral deals concluded in the UN, the Global Compacts on Migration and Refugees, with their strong emphasis on soft law, voluntary processes, and for the Global Compact on Refugees, also very much these notions of refugee resilience, of self-reliance, and aid for host communities in the regions of origin. So this would be my inputs.
Thank you, Sandra. And like at first glance, at least, it looks like there might be some discussion between you and Diego in a sense of this kind of legal perspective, but also you do sound more pessimistic, genuinely more pessimistic than Diego does. And I assume that's really something to be discussed in more detail. And I would like to hear more later on again on the role of the UNHCR and the Global Compact, and why or how this particular Global Compact is different from the other one, and whether it has any chances of actually being or remaining alive, and even in short-term perspective, let's say. So those are kind of reflections that I would like to hear more about for you to maybe think now. Now I can move on, but before we do that, I also want to, and this is the right moment to do it, to actually remind you that Nicola Piper, who is going to intervene now with her kind of short reflection, is also going to be our keynote right after this roundtable session. So I just remind you all, guys, do not leave the session. It's going to continue technically in the same space, in the same room B. You don't need to leave and then come back again, which makes it more difficult. We'll just have a technical break of 10 minutes in between, but you don't need to switch it off, So just remain with us, and it's going to be a kind of a long reflection on the global governance of migration with different perspectives inside. Now, Nicola has just a very short a time of 5 minutes to say something that she believes is important for now. Nicola, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Oleg. Can you hear me? Yeah, does it work? Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Oleg. Also, it's great to join this panel and to be with colleagues, I haven't seen in person for such a long time, and to be sort of in Russia and in Oleg's really nice home office, which sort of looks like a rustic hut in the mountains where I'd rather be right now, although I guess it's probably very cold in Russia. Yeah, actually, it's the global governance of labor migration. So really my initial thoughts come from the perspective of someone who takes a particular interest in international migration, labor migration, so the cross-border mobility of workers. And therefore, in things like, if we talk about crisis, then the impact of crises on hiring practices, employment conditions, and wages. And when reading the, in preparation, the long, very interesting list of questions Oleg put to us, I actually sort of thought I'm going to try to combine my answer, a combined answer to like 3 questions. So one would be, what has sort of escaped scholarly attention up to now? What actors are involved in this space of global labor governance, and also the migrant experience or the migrant voice in this particular space. So really trying to combine those 3 in one. And I guess, because human mobility has become an intrinsic feature of the global economy, one of the key issues, when sort of trying to assess the impact of crises on international labor migration is, in my view, related to the breadth and depth of financialization and the question of how financial crises have shaped the world of work and the dynamics of international labor migration. So I really would say it's financial crisis, which is a big and possibly even the main contributor to what I see as the malfunctioning of the global governance, migration governance system. And at this point, I have to say, I sort of follow on from Sandra, because Oleg said, we are now moving down the pessimistic slide. So we are now moving down even more pessimistically. So yeah, the malfunctioning of the global governance system from the perspective of the experience of the many migrant workers who labor today, under increasingly rigid migration policies, under temporary contracts, often without authorization, typically in low-wage sectors, and whose situation is characterized by, numerous rights violations, which have been amply documented by international NGOs and scholars, researchers, think tanks, and so forth. And it is this aspect of financialization that, in my mind, is often overlooked when we talk about migration and in the context of crises and in relation to what has also become the new normal. And by new normal here, I mean the expanding presence of the highly precarious migrant labor force, who essentially carry out, the so-called essential jobs the functioning of our societies have become so dependent on, and whom we have so much heard about during the current crisis, COVID. And it is, in fact, it has actually been shown by social scientists, the extent to which financialization has infiltrated every aspect of society, clashing with the principle of national sovereignty and also impacting on multilateralism. So I personally would really say it's also financialization, which really plays a big part in sabotaging the global framework for, safe, orderly, and regular migration, as per the Global Compact's title. And the reason why I sort of tend to argue this more and more is because really over the last 20 years, I have sort of witnessed the emergence of, I suppose, by global governance migration by participating and observing quite closely various processes, led by states and facilitated by the United Nations, as well as, observing the situation from below, if you like, by documenting migrants' everyday experiences. And migrant rights advocates have been really unable to prevent the institutionalized exploitation and criminalization of migrant workers. And again, a situation which has been amply exposed during the current crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, I have participated in so many webinars over the last few months, about, topicalizing issues such as, the wage theft and so forth. And to come back to the global governance space, so what we can see really is it's in terms of actors and who is present. We see finance ministers, investment bankers, consultancy firms who now occupy prominent roles in this global governance process. And so much talk about, public-private partnerships, business platforms, and so forth. And while on the other hand, the space for labor organizers, human rights activists, and legal advocates is in actual fact getting narrower and narrower. And even representatives, from lucrative industries involved in migrant recruitment, remittance transfers, and policing, they're all increasingly present. And these developments really, which by the way also picks up on Sandra's issue about, the increasing commercialization and marketization we can see. And these developments are also indicative of, the connection between human and capital mobility, which in my view calls for a more systematic investigation, which I also must admit I haven't done yet, but I'm intrigued to sort of get dug into a little bit more. So to conclude, I would say today the global discourse around low-wage, highly precarious migrant workers has come to be framed around, as Sandra already said, resilience rather than rights. And in this sense, migrants are the risk bearers of the global economy, absorbing the shocks of systemic volatility by working at less pay and often under inferior conditions, without any safety nets, easily disposable when no longer needed, as we could have seen, from so many examples during COVID, of migrants just suddenly being, disposed, dumped in front of embassies, being repatriated. So one might really say migrant workers serve as a form of human currency, providing stimulus on increasingly precarious global labor markets. So I would really end by reiterating that I personally think we need to dig much deeper into exploring how patterns of labor migration and its governance are inflected by the financialization of our economic and social lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm really looking forward to continuation of this, list, let's say, of issues and problems indeed that you enumerate in the follow-up in the keynote. For now, I would like to give the floor to Anna Triandafiliou from Toronto. Very early in the morning, Anna, we need to emphasize that so that people would understand that you are here with us starting from 8 in the morning, which for me is just terrible because I normally leave at night or, second part of the day. So really, it's a huge effort and I appreciate. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oleg, and wonderful to be with everyone online. As Nicola was saying, yes, we have had the luxury of meeting more during the pandemic rather than less. Only it is a mediated meeting, not an in-presence one. And I think that is one probably good thing that will stay with us. I think after the pandemic, that I think we will be doing a bit of both. I think, of course, the in-person meetings and conferences are a totally different thing in many respects, in both the depth and breadth of engagement. But it is also true that the luxury of connecting, like all of us, although I very much look forward, Oleg, that you invite us to St. Petersburg again, and we can come, really. But it is also wonderful that we can connect, yes, and indeed I'm nearly at the other side of the earth, and with 8 hours difference. But I'm very happy to connect. Yeah, I think my comments will follow up very nicely from those of Nicola, but with a slightly more positive outlook. I think some of the questions you asked us all about crisis and what the crisis brings, I think, and I think Carolina also mentioned this, what can we learn from the economic crisis of 2008-9, and in Europe in particular, the Eurozone crisis that continued for a good part of the 2010s. in relation, well, generally, but also particularly in relation to migration. And I think what I'm learning, and also in relation to the emergency, the refugee emergency of 2015, is that crisis does indeed bring with it the seeds of change. And we've seen important policy innovation happening. I think less with the Eurozone crisis, more with the refugee emergency. Immediately, we had very important policy developments. And here too, actually yesterday I was at another roundtable on labor migration in among EU and OECD countries in, during and after the pandemic. And I was studying before that roundtable. And there's been really so many measures taken by different destination countries to cover for people with temporary and precarious status. Most countries, I can say, in the EU and in the OECD that are important destination countries have automatically or through facilitated procedures provided for legal status, for some for 2 months, some for 6 months, some for the end of the year. Several countries have done regularization programs. Again, the largest is the one of Italy, which is now, closed in August, and there have been 207,000 applications. But we know also there's been, for Canada, for instance, I think it was probably the first time in the country's history that the minister in August said anyone who is here with their status expired after January, we give them until December to switch to a different status, process their papers, etc. We have seen that all the countries have provided health emergency coverage for anyone in their territory, regardless of status. And you might say that for some countries that was already the case, but it was not for all. We have also seen that there have been special provisions for people working in the essential, so-called essential sectors like farm work and care work. Again, I can give the example of Canada, where asylum seekers working in senior care homes have been, again, exceptionally given fast track to permanent residency. I think there's been, again, across the countries, very inclusive measures in terms of benefits given in relation to losing your employment because of COVID. In Canada, for instance, this is the first time that platform workers like Uber and similar are entitled to this unemployment benefit, which normally is not the case. And I know that through, at least the reports, that there are some very interesting reports produced by the European Migration Network in collaboration with the OECD Director for Employment, which outline this, these changes. So the question now for me is, will these changes survive? Or was this a one-off, emergency reaction, and then nothing will come out of it? And the lesson that I'm trying to learn is from what happened, for instance, in relation to the revision of the Dublin system in the EU, which in 2016 was seen as moribund, and we're going to do something more inclusive, more progressive, more responsibility sharing. And now we have seen with the pact, with the EU pact that was launched in September, that a lot of some things have survived, but a lot of the more solidarity and responsibility sharing, how can I say, obligatory responsibility sharing has dwindled. So I think that this is for me one question, and of course I take your point, Nicola, that is a little bit more pessimistic, but I think that that's a question. And the second, I think, is a general observation about uncertainty. I think, again, a positive thing that I see with the crisis, and I hope we can turn it even further into a positive thing with regard to migration governance, is that suddenly we realize that uncertainty is not just about asylum seekers, it's not just about places where there is war. Uncertainty affects all of us and affects also those so-called developed countries or affluent countries that are mainly destination places rather than transit or origin places. And so that we have seen also a turn towards more Keynesian policies in the economic sector, and a recognition suddenly that we're all in this. We're not in this together equally, I would say, because also in terms of the the trade-off between migration, for instance, and international trade and global value chains, we have seen already in May, Primark, the big clothes retail, how can I say, firm, unloading the the decreased demand, unloading it to the Bangladeshi subcontractors, canceling their orders rather than kind of sharing at least the the decline and the cost of the crisis. So, and in that, I want to also, launch into the floor for discussion. I don't know, I suppose you may have not seen this, but the Canadian government on the 30th of October announced an increase in its immigration targets. Now, a small bracket for those who are not familiar, Canada has a totally proactive immigration policy. Every year there is about 350,000 people coming to the country. The country has in total about 35 million people. So I'm saying this because I think it is important also to give a sense of the, of the magnitude. And when I'm saying 350,000 people, I'm talking about permanent residents, people who arrive directly in the country as permanent residents. So, for instance, myself, I wouldn't be included into this because I arrived in the country with a temporary work permit. So on top of this, you have temporary work permits, international students, refugee claimants, and so on. And of these 350,000, 2/3 roughly, or a bit more, are labor migrants, 1/3 are family and humanitarian. So family members and humanitarian. And Canada is failing to meet, and the programming is 3 years. So it was supposed to be 20 to 2022, 1 million people. Of course, we're not going to reach the targets for 2020 because of the, breakdown of international transport, the closure of borders. Now the borders in Canada are open, but the processing is slow. So the government said, no, we need to, migration is part of the recovery. Migration is good, and we're increasing our targets. So we're going to bring in the next 3 years 100, I think it's about 1.2 million instead of 1 million. And of course, as you can imagine, there is right now a little bit of a debate on whether migration is a lever for development or whether this will be a recipe for disaster, because the people who will come will suffer more in terms of finding jobs. And I'll stop here.
Anna, thank you very much. I should apologize because I was so excited to listen in that I actually forgot to share your bio when you started, so I just did it now that everyone could see. Thanks a lot for these reflections. I should admit that there was a sort of a surprise for me, but probably also it's also probably a good moment that you did not really, none of you, and I was expecting also Anna, you in particular, that you maybe would focus on issues not only of migration but integration. And quite unexpectedly, this will now come from me, because this was not really, it was never my topic, and I should say that's why I was actually sort of given a negative note saying to Carolina, no, I'm not really going to talk about Russia, and I'll explain why. So I will talk about Russia. Mostly in questions and answers, I'm quite happy to talk about Russia. But now, instead of what I kind of planned to do, I changed my idea of this kind of opening reflections completely. And this is as a result of what I would call an external shock. And this external shock is something that I actually saw posted on LinkedIn 2 days ago. And I'll tell you what's the story about. The story is about Belgium. That's one explanation why it touched me so seriously, because that's really a country that I love. I spent there quite some time, and I probably one of those countries that I know better than others in Europe. But the story is really frightening, and at the same time is not very specific for Belgium, I would say, unfortunately. It does look to me that this kind of story, if not yet repeated, although I would not have been surprised if it already happened elsewhere, something like this, it might repeat. It might repeat specifically in the context that we are now. What's the story about? The story is about a Belgian scholar who is a professor at the Free University of Brussels, who is a specialist of Muslim communities, who's recently published a book about Islams in Belgium, who's tried for many years to research and write about Islam not only for academia and for scholars, but also, what is in French called vulgarisation. So kind of disseminating really science and results of research to the broader audience, to population. This research is now being attacked very seriously for her expert opinion and opinions, and specifically for an article that she published like roughly a bit more than a week ago, an article in which she tried to go a little bit counter the general kind of dominant discourse that emerged in France after the events that we all know about. The terrible events, obviously. What is going on now with this professor in Belgium is basically she is being accused of ties with Islamists. She is being accused of being a radical, and all sorts of things. I'm not going to repeat. Most of the information that I could find when I started digging into that is in French, unfortunately. So for those who do not speak French, it's a little bit difficult, but I can then forward you the information if you want. It's not important for me, the details of the case that much. I mean, the case could have been typical, and it could have happened to any of us sitting here or anyone else dealing with issues of migrant integration, and looking at it not through a kind of narrow-minded perspective of whatever, the state or political parties, or, let me be very frank and very, very sharp, of this obsession with the secular state that exists in France. And I sort of put for myself here a list of things that I believe is important to address. And this is a part of this crisis dynamics, but this is also something that is important and relevant for those with whom yesterday we discussed in a different panel, we discussed academic freedom. Well, the whole discussion now and the support that this person, well, it's great to see support that this person is getting from her university. So the Free University of Brussels has expressed explicit support for her, but also the Belgian French-speaking Association of Political Science has done the same. So that's great. That's an effort. The problem is that the attacks on her came from the scholarly and expert community. And that's, for me, is really something outrageous. The attacks on her, one of the first attacks on her came from the Observatory of Islamic Radicalization that exists in Belgium and is apparently also getting funds from the Belgian state. And there is now a huge scandal and debate there, and the society is polarized, and the academic community is also greatly divided. And for me, all this is really in the context of, yes, indeed, on the one hand, you might have all sorts of justifications for why the secular state is great or why religion should be out of the public space. But on the other hand, you should not cross certain limits, and you should definitely allow free research. And then the question for me is, how can we actually continue? And that's one of those questions that I thought of in a very different context, in the context of linking migration and pandemic, migration and other crises. But this is a crisis for me that is shrinking political opportunity structures, clearly, and is also shrinking structures of involvement of researchers in debate, in an informed debate and reflection on issues. This hugely Islamophobic kind of reaction that she is getting is very indicative of a very sick state of societies, apparently. In this case, the Belgian one, but apparently also part of the French society, because there is no will to have a normal discussion and reflection and go beyond this kind of obsession with certain values while absolutely rejecting other types of values. And I'm just looking at this quite, well, surprised and shocked indeed, because generally what I wanted to talk about initially related to this fact that how do we look at politics of migration and politics of migration and integration? And I'm not the one of those who would say politicization is bad, because I would say when we have politicization, it means we have politics. What we do witness now, sort of naturally with the pandemic and anti-pandemic measures, we do witness a move, a sharp move from politics and governance to management. And this technocratic thing that has been promoted by different types of actors, both national and international, now this for me is a new normality. Because yes, indeed, there have been measures taken, kind of good ones, the same that you, Anna, mentioned, that have been taken in different countries in Europe and in the West generally. Similar measures were also taken in Russia, extension without any requirements of all sorts of documents by default, so that migrants would be able to stay here, first for 3 months, then for 3 more months. And now, if I'm not mistaken, it's somewhere here, November or December, and I would imagine that there would be a new extension of the status. So you have this, but on the other hand, when it comes to the kind of public debate and discussion, when it comes to what is the rationale behind these measures, well, the rationale behind is usually very technocratic, but the problem is that the politics or the political space is really not only not opening up, it's really becoming that small now. And I believe we do need to have this kind of discussions that go beyond simply stating and restating Republican values, if we talk about France or anything else. Because we stigmatize people, we stigmatize Muslims, in this case Muslims, but it could be any other group. You know, imagine this, if that becomes all of a sudden something else and not Muslims. This stigmatization, this rejection, and this need to sort of abandon religious affinities and religious adherences and religious settings, abandon them in order to become a kind of a proper, in this case, Republican or integrated in a Republican model. I don't believe that's the right way. And I'm looking at Anna, and I was saying that because I also saw that you've published a blog on that, and I believe this blog that you've published with your colleague from India is really a great kind of start. This is in a much softer way, in a much nicer and more research kind of framed way, and I'm being very emotional now. But for me, that's really an important kind of topic to address. So I want just to stop with this and want to see kind of your reactions and also reflections from the audience of whether this kind of discussions should be really open, whether we should be transparent, and whether we should allow this kind of reactions that are being now forced, let's say, in the public space and towards this particular professor in Belgium, whether we should allow them to go unnoticed and do nothing about them without trying to actually interfere as researchers, as scholars, but also as policymakers, because I can't really see now the Belgian state acting. And for me, that's a major problem. If I was asking the question, what is the multi-level, multi-actor, and multi-dimensional kind of transformations of governance of migration and integration, how do I expect actors on different levels to transform or bring about positive change if some of those actors are actually being involved in perpetuation of quite destructive agendas? So those are the kind of, questions and arguments that I wanted to put forward in my opening part. Sorry for being longer than all of you, but just I abused my right of the moderator, as you could expect it quite easily knowing me. So that's probably it. Now I need to I need to look in the chat box because I see there are apparently questions here. Yes. Yes. Okay. Well, there is a technical question from someone who missed the start of it, whether it will be available on YouTube. Yes. It's being live streamed and it will be still available after the event. So it's possible to use the link. The link is in the program somewhere, so that's possible to use that. And now I see questions. I guess I'll just start with this one that Yuri sent to me. So let me read the question basically. The question is from Andrei Leonov. Question to all speakers: could you give an example or examples of EU effective or efficient reactions in migration or any other areas to COVID pandemic, where actually it acted as a supranational entity within a framework of a relatively consistent policy, not as separate nation states? Could you say that some kind of solidarity took place with regard to the pandemic? This is a question very important in terms of policy learning in case of the Eurasian Economic Union, which has been described by some colleagues during one of the previous today's sessions as absolutely inactive with regard to the pandemic challenges. So it's kind of several questions in one, but I guess you understand, you know, the general line. So whoever would like to address that, just please switch on your mic and or raise your hand. I guess the Yuri will have to activate your mics probably. I guess that's, oh no, Anna.
It is working. No,
oh,
but
okay, perfect.
Is the question for the EU or for the Eurasian?
No, the question is for the EU, because we would like to learn. We would like to learn whether the EU has acted as really a supranational actor in this sphere, and how to see what can be done here.
Well, perhaps Diego or Andrea are better placed to answer than me. But I think first of all, that was the first time we saw the EU citizenship having a balance, regardless of national citizenship. So when the EU closed its borders, also when the very first time was when the United States closed its borders towards the EU, which actually was very interesting, because it didn't close its borders to the non-EU countries, but only to the EU countries. But also the fact that EU citizenship allowed you to circulate within the EU. Of course, there's been, in relation to pandemic outbreaks, some closures and some openings. But for instance, for me, living in Canada, that was a true expression. It was a very different situation, because for instance, me being a temporary migrant in Canada, there was a concern initially that if I left the country, I might be locked out, because the border was open initially for permanent residents and citizens. Then soon it became also open for temporary residents. But so I do think the EU citizenship suddenly became more important and more autonomous with regard to national citizenship. And also the EU has been bolder in taking measures to address the emergency, even bolder than it was with the Eurozone crisis, and perhaps equally bold with addressing the refugee emergency. But in terms, Oleg, of are you suggesting, was your intervention about, is integration or is diversity taking a backseat because of COVID, or was this a general question? I'm not aware of the Belgian case that you're mentioning, but I think this is a separate issue and a separate debate, where the main link with the pandemic could only be in the way Macron reacted to the events in, I think, trying to, in the middle of a COVID resurgence in France and all the problems related to this. I think he was very wrong in reacting to the events in such a way, while we saw Kurz from Austria, the least likely person to be in favor of diversity, to react in a more cold-blooded and better way. And I think probably he had learned the lesson from Macron's reaction. But anyhow, but maybe this is taking us too far from our main focus, which I think is the governance of migration during and after the pandemic. So,
yes and no, because I did not, with the roundtable, I did not mean to focus only on pandemic. The idea was to actually refer to also other sorts of crisis conditions. When in crisis, you are sort of allowed to take measures that you take them as measures taken exclusively in the case of crisis, but then this type of measures might just follow when the crisis is sort of recognized as being over. And in this sense, yes, the pandemic is certainly something that occupies our minds mostly, but that's not the only type of crisis, because obviously the reference here is also to the migration crisis in the Mediterranean and the European Union and all sorts of attitudes then, remembering everything that we saw also in the media. But now, for me, it's also a kind of a illustration of a general, very kind of, generally tense atmosphere, if I may put it this way, because of everything altogether. But the problem is that we see this kind of reactions that I described. I mean, the Belgian case, in Belgium, that's really a big case now. And what's important is that the Belgian case is related directly to French one, because it just started from an article by a Belgian scholar, a recognized scholar with a reputation from the Free University of Brussels, her article on the French events. her reflection on the French events provoked a reaction from another group of researchers in Belgium saying that she is connected to Muslim Brothers and to radical Islamist groups, and that's the reason why she is defending Muslims. So she is basically not allowed to defend Muslims or even to explain that, as she says in her book and in her works, that Muslims are also part of the Belgian society. So for me, that's an important part of discussion because it does interfere very clearly, it does overlap to such, for example, trivial and banal statements that we used to have and we all know about, as that migrants are stealing our jobs. Well, they do steal our jobs in crisis even more than, we follow these logics of job stealing. And then the discussion of these migrants are not really to come up here with the values that they have. Well, that's kind of a discussion that usually pops up again and again when you do have a certain type of crisis. For me, when the situation is more or less calm, if you want, this kind of comments or this kind of reactions probably would have been and would have seemed completely inappropriate. But now what's really worrying for me is that after the situation that has happened to this particular professor in Belgium, we do not see a clear reaction from the Belgian state that would say that is inappropriate, which for me is a sort of justification of the position of those who are trying to attack her. And for me, that's really a worrying trend. And I believe that's something that prevents us from normal kind of research on integration issues, because we are not able then to engage with issues that are seen as, I don't know, something that is something that should not be touched upon, basically, in particular context of particular states within the European Union, to put it this way at least. Something that is difficult to address now in the French context. I would not even imagine myself now being in a situation of being physically back to France, because for me it would be very difficult, to not to engage in debates with many of my colleagues in France, who would just aggressively defend the point that the only standard we have to stick to is the secular state and the freedom of speech for some, and no freedom of speech for others. And I doubt someone can, blame me for being a supporter of Muslim Brothers or any kind of radical groups. But I believe that this is really a double standard that we are witnessing. And I think that's important to talk about. And for me, this is very worrying, because we are talking about what is seen as liberal democracy, which is at the same point not acting in a way of academic freedom, and at the same point not acting in a way of plurality, diversity, and all this kind of values that should be really important for a liberal democracy. So that's my point. Obviously not connected directly to the pandemic, not at all, but something that just came as really shocking for me, because for countries as small as Belgium is in terms of the academic community, many people know each other. I don't know this person, but some of those people whom I know in the Belgian academia know her. So then it becomes really, personal. Yeah, I see Sandra question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is really not my topic. I'm not doing research on that, and so I only speak in my personal identity. I feel a bit uncomfortable mixing what is happening in Belgium with this scholar with the discourse in France on laïcité, because I think the context is very different. In the Belgian case, you report us of a scholar who is being limited in her academic freedom by populist sentiments and identitarian politics. But I mean, you address France much more broadly with regard to its laïcité and relationship to religious political expressions. And we all have in mind the terrorist attacks that have happened in the last days. And in this respect, I feel a bit uncomfortable putting the French discourse about laïcité and Macron's recent statements directly in a relationship to the problem of the Belgian scholar. I think these are different spheres, different contexts, and it's dangerous to put them together, because it just adds to this polarization and heated environment.
Sandra, not to spend all this time on the discussion of this, just to clarify, the whole problem with her happened exactly because she has given her opinion on the French case. So she expressed very clearly her opinion that the policy of France, the policy and politics, and the French model is really behind what's going on and all sorts of problems. And exactly for this, she has been criticized not by populist groups, which would not be a surprise, but by scholars and experts in Belgian context who said that she does not have the right to say this. For me, this is the problem. I believe we as scholars have the right to say what we think as scholars. Otherwise, we just, lose all sort of value, and the profession becomes an empty, kind of exercise. That's my point, and for me that's really a hugely serious case. But I wouldn't like to, of course, to take all the time of the discussion, especially because we have a question that diverts us completely from this difficult debate to something more relevant for migration governance generally. The question from Asil Murzakulova, I guess everyone can read it now, but I'll still also read it aloud. It's for all speakers. We can see the rising role of state apparatus in migration systems around the world during pandemic. How do you see the perspectives for the non-state actors in formulation of migration policy during the pandemic crisis? Who would like to pick on that? Diego?
Yeah, I can go ahead. Perhaps by offering some brief reflections on the case of South America, I think the role of non-state actors in that particular region has become much more relevant and central in the last few years. And that is partly a result of having more immigration in the region because of the movement of 5 million Venezuelans in the last 5 years, but in reality in the last 3 years. But that is also, so that is partly the result of that, immigration becoming more important, not only emigration as it was usually the case historically, recently in history for some countries in South America. But also I think the role of courts has become very important in the region. We see the role of courts also being very important in Europe. There is a recent ruling from the European Court of Justice adopted a few weeks ago that contradicts a ruling by the Supreme Court in Spain. And as a result of that ruling, basically the meaning of that ruling is that undocumented migrants in Spain, by and large, cannot be expelled. They need to be imposed a fine. And it's a complex legal ruling, and if someone is interested, they can contact me, and I can point them out into the direction of that particular ruling. But I think that the role, of course, has become very important, the role of civil society and the role of academics more and more in regions where perhaps they were not that relevant only 10 years ago. And that is what I'm mentioning South America, but now they are certainly much more important. So yes, there are openings and spaces being open for other actors to also play an important role in trying to influence policies, I would say.
Thank you, Diego. Can you hear me? Okay. Nicola, please.
Maybe I can sort of approach this question maybe from the perspective of civil society, including trade unions. And I guess on one level, ironically, the COVID, the pandemic, has actually helped to expose the situation of foreign workers, precisely because many of them work in the so-called, what was classified as essential work, in the food production, in care and nursing, and in this context, unions and civil society actors were actually able to say, well, look, these are, vital workers in our societies who contribute vital services, and we need to now also kind of, show under what conditions they work, and they need maybe at least regularization and so forth. And at least as far as in Europe is concerned, I'm not saying as an overall global or unified policies, as for example, on the part of the EU, but in terms of snippets of responses, so for example in Germany and Britain, suddenly the government did in actual fact start investigating, for example, the meat production sector, because there were these outbreaks of COVID, and suddenly it was exposed under what sort of conditions many of these workers, again many of whom are foreigners, have been working. Or the irony also around in the agriculture sector, right? I mean, here in Britain we had this very short campaign around Pig for Britain, trying to entice British people to pig over the summer, when officially, no one was supposed to be traveling across borders. And of course it didn't work, so what happened, despite the formal border closure, Romanians were brought in, and also you might remember when the Prime Minister Boris Johnson was he actually was in hospital for quite some time, when he finally emerged alive and still kicking, he actually did point out, the two key nurses who looked after him were in actual fact foreigners, and Portuguese, I believe, or Spanish, the other one from New Zealand. So again, trying to say, well, actually, foreigners are making a very important contribution. To what extent this actually will, change things in the long term, I don't know, but I'm at least a little bit optimistic with regard to certain sectors, how at least now in the meat production, some investigation has started, and some, I believe at least the German government has started looking into some legal reform around meat production. And at the same time, the region I happen to know best about, which is actually Asia, here again, it's civil society that's done an awful lot of initial, if you like, humanitarian work on the ground, the diaspora organizations in the Gulf or Malaysia, Singapore, who, distributed food to the many suddenly retrenched migrants, and also assisting them, to be repatriated and returned. Again, in terms of having concrete influence on migration policy in the longer term, is still to be seen. I do know of a few campaigns, and one particular key campaign in Asia revolves around wage theft. So the massive problem around, wages not being paid or underpaid, which has existed, for a long time, not only since the pandemic, but the pandemic again has exacerbated the problem. And this is in actual fact being launched into a global campaign. So these the civil society network and the trade unions are trying to make the International Labour Organization to place it on its agenda next year. So this is hopefully going to push, and the global trade unions are on board, and they of course have quite a bit of political influence. So we might see some change in some form in some areas, whether it's in certain sectors or in relation to specific issues, such as, for example, wage theft.
Thank you, Nicola. Anyone else on this question of non-state actors? I see, Carolina, do you have is this a hand? Ah, yes, okay, yeah, go ahead.
I think it might be easier if I just raise my hand physically for you to see. So maybe again the post-Soviet context to answer Asa's question and the Russia-Central Asia relation here. I think there are very interesting dynamics happening during the COVID pandemic. because there is, I don't know if we can call it the rising role of the state. I would say that the state is left alone de facto, because in a normal situation, we have international organizations who discursively and in practice interfere into state policies on migration and in other fields in Central Asia. And they have lots to say on many different topics. But when it comes to the crisis, the state is left alone. And I think this is because of very long and very complex decision-making processes happening within international organizations and obviously channels of funding. There needs to be a donor there are long approvals, and then these channels from the headquarters to the regional office to the country office and so on. So what happens in practice, referring to my favorite case of Tajikistan and Russia, that in a situation when many migrants losing jobs wanted to be repatriated to Tajikistan, and the Tajik state finds itself on its own, but without resources as well. So in the first place, it's about negotiating of the charter flights, and the number of people who are willing to come up is obviously enormous, and the capacities technical capacities to bring them are also very limited. So there are also many murky mechanisms emerging, how migrants actually, want to go up in the list to be repatriated to Tajikistan. It fuels corruption in many cases, but we don't really know what's happening. We just have rumors about it. And in this situation, organizations like IOM or many others are completely silent, which I think tells a lot about we can justify it, right, because of this mechanism of funding and generally how IOs function, but it's a very telling story in this case. So we have why I'm saying I'm not sure if the role of the state is rising, because the state has intention to take over, but it doesn't really do it in practice for many different reasons. And also the decision making is very, very complex, and these negotiations with the host country or with other countries in the middle, if we talk about repatriation, not by plane, but through land, and you have, other countries you need to agree with. And in all of this, we have IOM, for example, that in the news just tries to collect money from all other international organizations to organize some buses to bring people from Kazakhstan. We talk about one bus, so these are very kind of peanuts in all of this situation. But what's also interesting here is that in this moment of crisis, we actually hear migrants' voices for the first time. This is because they start complaining because they have a problem and no one can help them. And the usual channels of assistance, for example, relying on self-reliance, relying on diaspora networks, on networks of migrants, do not really work because everyone is in the same situation. This is when migrants start demanding from the state. I think it happens for the first time in this context, Russia, Central Asia.
Thank you, Karolina. Anne has signaled that she would like to say something on the role of civil society actors. So,
Karolina, this is very interesting also, all that you're saying, and I was not aware of the dynamics in Central Asia. I wanted to say, I think, and also in reflection to what Nicola said, I think the role of civil society actors of destination countries has been proven to be very important. And I think in different European countries, like also, well, Germany, as you point out, but also Italy and Spain and Canada, for instance, there's been important mobilization, which has exposed problems that existed before, but they have just been magnified under the lens of the pandemic. So deplorable living and working conditions, as you said, promises not kept, contracts being signed. Also in Britain, research has found that, contracts were signed, but then the payment was not what it was supposed to be. And as we know, particularly seasonal migrants or temporary precarious migrants they prefer to withstand this exploitation and come back next year rather than complain. And I think there's been more emphasis on monitoring. For instance, I think in Europe, there was more awareness, at least in Southern Europe, that we need more monitoring, even if this doesn't exist. But there was awareness. I think in Canada, it almost came as a surprise because the authorities said, why? We have a complaint mechanism. How can we start a process if there's no complaint? And I think civil society and the workers themselves said, yeah, of course you need to have monitoring and, a surprise kind of, checks, not announced checks, because people it's very difficult to file a complaint. most of all, there is always the penalty that you may not be called back. And I think that raises the question, I don't know, Nicola, if you have insights from Southeast Asia on this, of the recruitment at origin, which was discussed in this panel where I was yesterday as well, because, for instance, the Spanish program of recruiting at origin in Morocco for seasonal workers through the Moroccan state agency, ANAPEC, is seen as a good practice. Similarly, Canada recruiting in Mexico through the involvement of the Mexican government is also seen as a good practice, but it seems to me that it exposes a lot of, it hides rather a lot of vulnerability, because for the same reasons that migrants are afraid not to be blacklisted, not to be called again. So I wonder what happens in Southeast Asia on this. And then I wanted, if we want to also include another topic in the discussion, I wanted to also raise the issue that Andrew mentioned in the beginning about the role of attitudes for the migration governance. And maybe, Andrew, you want to say a bit more? That's why I also said, in Canada also there's been a survey published in the last couple of weeks that was conducted in September. It's part of a series of surveys done by an institute called Environics. And it showed that Canadians' views on immigration and asylum have grown positive. They've grown positive, and the difference is more old people, more people living in small places, more voters of the Conservative Party of Canada are less negative / more positive towards immigration and asylum seeking. And also there's an interesting impact that usually people in Canada, first-generation naturalized citizens, so first-generation migrants would be a bit more negative towards further immigration, but now they're more positive. So I think it would be good to also to discuss this issue of public attitudes and how they affect governance of migration.
Andrew, would you like to pick up on that from like cross-regional comparison or something that you would prefer to focus?
Yeah, sure. Thanks to Anna for raising that point. I've seen the Canadian research because she shared it a couple of weeks ago. I think 2 points. First of all, for the countries where we have data, attitudes to migration are generally stable, have become more favourable over the last 20 years as a result of generational change. It's one of the great myths about migration politics in destination countries, that there's some kind of tidal wave of anti-immigration sentiment. There's no evidence for that. Generally, attitudes have become more favourable over time, and I think that's as a result of generational change. It doesn't mean there are not people who are opposed to migration. Clearly there are, and a lot of the debate, a lot of the hostility to migration has been the activation of latent anti-immigration tendencies amongst sections of the electorate. So I think there's contestation clearly, but long-term shifts in attitudes to migration are really significant. Doesn't mean that people are becoming more positive about migration, but the debate is much more nuanced than some representations of it. So to say that attitudes are more favourable doesn't mean that people are just becoming wildly enthusiastic about migration. Far from it, but the debate is more nuanced. So I think that's an important point, but also following on, I think, from a point Diego made at the start, and in something that I saw shared today by the Overseas Development Institute, we know very little about attitudes to migration outside of the usual suspects. So some great work on Africa by the Afrobarometer survey. We're doing some work here at the Migration Policy Centre on North Africa and the Middle East with the ICMPD. But I think more knowledge can help, because the reason, if we know more about attitudes to migration, we can understand more about effective communication around migration as well. Because one of the things I think we've been working on quite a lot is communication around migration. And for a communication to be effective, it has to resonate with people's attitudes and values as they are, because attitudes to migration are formed relatively early in life, are relatively stable, and are unlikely to change because of the way in which they're formed, like attitudes to most social and political issues. So knowing more about attitudes means being able to communicate more effectively about migration, and then perhaps also being able to do so in different contexts, in South America, in Africa, in parts of Asia. So I think it's an important point that Anna raised.
And to add to that, Anna is also, as you can see in the chat, she's also adding a reflection that there might be something related to the pandemic dynamics, as I understand. I mean, the speculation could be that, for example, what we at least observe in Russia is that migrants, despite all sorts of problems and limitations, migrants still go to work. And they still go to work when even it's dangerous to work. And so they do contribute to our own comfort and welfare. And that might create a different image if we are talking about the role of perceptions. But for me, it's just a speculation. I'm not aware of any, research.
We published something as a short briefing paper for IOM, which I'll share in the chat box because you might find it interesting, because we argue that the pandemic is unlikely to make much in terms of long-term attitudinal change. We argue the pandemic is unlikely to have a major effect because the trends are long-term, over time, last 20 years. The financial crisis doesn't seem to have affected them dramatically. Even the migration crisis didn't really disrupt trends. It affected salience, but long-term trends. I'll share it with you because I think Anna actually published one of these things as well for IOM. I think Diego and Nicola may have been involved as well recently in some work with Marie Macaulay. But I'll share it now so you can, if anybody's interested, they can look at it.
And also later on, we can try to probably share them on our website, simply for those who are interested. If there are no more comments on this particular question or around this, I would like to go back to what I've mentioned before as something that I've noted. Well, Carolina addressed one point. So that's exactly on this kind of attempts of the sending countries to somehow change their position in this current crisis, or somehow to negotiate what can be done, let's say, and to somehow attempt to do something. But last week, Diego and I were in a different meeting, and there was something mentioned that sort of, I said, oops, for me that's a surprise, probably I'm not following. Someone said, we have already so much written about the role of cities in migration governance. And I said, do we really have, and in particular, do we actually have research now on the role of cities in mitigating negative consequences of the pandemic for migration governance, or for migrants themselves in the first place? If you are aware of any of this, I would be really, happy to hear your insights on that, if any of you know something. And anyone? Could that be sort of an evidence that we don't really have that much written? Oh, Sandra, please.
Well, Barbara Omen, I think she's from Utrecht University, somewhere in the Netherlands. She has led a major project on the topic. I think, Andrew, she was at the EUI, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was. And just to plug our centre, the Migration Policy Centre, yesterday we published a working paper by Tiziana Caponio and Anthony Clement, comparing Turin and Saint-Étienne as cities, looking at local responses, diversity of those responses in post-industrial cities. So if anyone was interested in that, that was, well, I'm turning into a publicist here. I can post a link to that as well. But that looks at how cities network and how resources at city level affect the capacity to network. But that's quite a theme of work. I think in the EMISCO network in Europe, there's a lot of work on this multi-level governance city networks. Tiziana Caponio in University of Turin has been very active in that work. And as I say, she published a paper with us yesterday on this.
Yeah, generally speaking, that's also something that relates to the Global Compact on migration, at least those, those ideas to make the role of cities more pronounced during negotiations. At least I remember Colleen Tues very much practically involved in that story.
Yeah. And she's publishing a paper on this, on the role of city networks, the Mayoral Forum that she has been co-leading in the review of global governance. It's called Global Governance Review of Multilateralism, later this year, if you are interested in that.
Yeah, well, I'm asking this because, some of the students were interested in this already last year, and apparently the trend might remain. But what's important is that not just, I am aware of the general kind of bulk of research in this field, more or less those who are those scholars who are interested in produce research, but how does it actually work in the context of the pandemic indeed? So this recent research that looks at this role, but in the current crisis dynamics, and how cities, whether they actually are capable of doing anything specifically when their kind of, possibilities are probably quite restrained. That's just my interest as well. And then there was this other question that I, because I'm asking questions because it looks like there are no other questions in the chat box, but tell me please if there are, and then I would not ask mine. I can't see any questions in the chat. So another question that I wanted to ask is, when we look at this multi-level settings, let's say, I mean, all of you said something about, but can we say that there is a sort of a general conclusion, or should we say, or can we say that the role of the state in the current crisis, the role that we see when the state is really the locus of decision making, can we say that this role will eventually be the leading one again? Or that's something temporary that we see now and that will not last? I understand I sound quite trivial, but I want to know your opinion on that. Anna?
Just a sec. I think that's a very interesting point, because suddenly I think the pandemic has made the state so important. I think that is very interesting. Suddenly the market, I mean, it's clear the market cannot address everything. And actually we've seen states acting against markets with the view of protecting people's health. We've seen, if you want, an absolute prioritizing of the sacredness of human life. I think I have to say, we had a little bit of a discussion over this in an ASIN, Association for the Studies of Ethnicity and Nationalism seminar in July, about should we, how do you balance out civil liberties with this view of the absolute sacredness of human life? And I think there is something to be said also about the state coming back in with a vengeance, like the state strikes back. And I think we will see this also in terms of, I'm not sure so much in the terms of governance of migration, although, for instance, also what Carolina was saying about the importance of countries of origin, for instance, for return and reintegration. And I know this is a huge issue also in South and Southeast Asia, because so many people are going back from the Gulf countries. And the states are asked to step up and step in. Same is true, apparently, people from Saudi Arabia are returning to Ethiopia. And I'm not sure that there was another question in your questions, in your initial questions, Oleg, that we didn't touch upon. And I don't know, maybe if Sandra is the right person to address this. Are the global compacts fit for purpose to address these issues? And for instance, what is then the relationship with this return of the state as such an important actor with global governance mechanisms? And is it good that I think the Global Compact for Migration was caught at the very early stage when it's still preparing? So is this a liability, or is this an advantage because they can shift their way of working? I'd be interested to hear about it.
Sandra, would you address that?
It's very difficult to give an assessment of these compacts at the moment, because they are very new and they have this particular implementation structure that is so much reliant on the pledges, the contributions of the countries. So we have had the first forum for the Refugee Compact last year. Was not spectacular. The Migration Compact will be only in 3 years, the first implementing round where states will account for their initiatives. So I think these two instruments are built so much, especially the Global Compact on Migration, on bottom-up state commitment. If you compare with the Paris Agreement on climate change, there you have at least first, a requirement that states define national implementation plans. So they are obliged to have a national implementation plan for climate agreement. And these plans, they are for 4 years, shall become every time more ambitious, right? We have nothing of that for the Global Compact on Migration. It's similar in its architecture in terms of voluntary contributions, but it does not oblige states to have national implementation plans. It invites them to do so, and it does not have this requirement of progressive deepening. So in a climate where we see also very much of a renationalization of these policies, also in Europe, and it's quite visible, the question about what the EU did, sort of, we went around it, but the EU did not do so much apart. Of course, there's institution of citizenship that helped for the EU citizens. So I think that we rather observe some renationalization, and not so sure about where the momentum will come from to really feed these new instruments.
Thank you, Sandra. Andrew, would you like to add something on this? On the state.
Sorry?
On the state.
Well, maybe it's different. I think another aspect of it might be in relation to politicization, because I think one of it certainly predates any of the crises we've been talking about, financial, migration, pandemic, a long-term shifts in the kind of social basis of politics in some of the major destination countries. So looking at those countries, but a lot of the dividing lines that are forming are really around the role of the state, but also the borders and boundaries of the state, national identity questions, which I think have become quite prominent around some of the key controversies that we see. So I think that the role of the state could also be understood in relation to the politicization of migration, but not only of migration, of globalization, and the kind of support for and resistance to it. And I think there's quite significant research evidence over the last 20 years that this has become part of a quite significant dividing line in politics, and many of the identity conflicts that we now see revolve around, arise from these kind of concerns. So it's a bit more, but I think it goes back to the point you made earlier, Oleg, about politicization.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm looking basically at where we are now, and we are now just 5 minutes, formally at least, 5 minutes before Nicola's keynote. So unfortunately, I have to kind of wrap it up, but I would like to tell you that if you want to, sharply and quickly say something in these very last minutes, you can. Please go ahead. If not, then we can wrap it up. I'm just asking this question. Technically, I suggested at the beginning, and for those who joined later, that we would make now 5 minutes technical break, but we don't have to switch off. I mean, switching off cameras and mics, that's fine, but we don't have to leave the Zoom session. And then we start. Why I'm saying that it's important to kind of not be late, because right after we are done, there's going to be another session after Nicola's keynote, because there has been some reshuffling in the program due to this, also the time zones and speakers. So we are not the last one during today's session. We will have to also respect that time limits. So I would like to, with this, very much thank you all for joining and for contributing and for discussing, and I don't know, for all the insights. I'm sure that's, it's always like this, that it's eventually it's never enough. Even 10 hours would not have been enough to discuss most of those issues that we would like to. But that's important to kind of see what are the lines that sort of interest you as researchers now, that you believe are important to follow and to look at. And I'm really thankful for that. So thank you all again. Yeah. A 5 minutes break now until we restart with Nicola. Yeah.